The research chamber fell silent as senior historian Vexal finished displaying the final data projection. The gathered council members of the Galactic Collective sat motionless in their observation pods. Some had forgotten to blink their secondary eyelids. Others had unconsciously retracted their sensory tendrils in what could only be described as fear. Vexal had spent 40 cycles compiling this report. 40 cycles of studying the species known as humans. 40 cycles of growing, increasingly disturbed by what the data revealed. Now, standing before the most powerful beings in 3 galaxies, the historian understood why the previous researcher had requested early retirement. The presentation had begun simply enough. Vexal showed the standard planetary survey data. Earth was a mid-sized world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The humans had evolved there roughly 300,000 cycles ago. They had developed technology. They had built civilizations. They had done all the things that thousands of other species had done across the cosmos. But then Vexal had shown them the timeline. The collective had existed for nearly 9 million cycles. In that time, they had observed and cataloged over 12,000 intelligent species. They had developed models and formulas that could predict, with near-perfect accuracy, how long it would take any civilization to reach certain milestones. These models had never failed, not once in 9 million cycles of observation, until humanity. Vexal pulled up the first anomaly. It was a conflict the humans called World War II. The historian explained that before this war, the nation called the United States of America had possessed a small military force. They were primarily concerned with internal matters. Their industrial capacity for warfare was minimal. Then another nation attacked them. Within 4 cycles of their standard years, the humans had transformed their entire civilization into a war machine. Factories that made consumer goods began producing weapons. Citizens who had never held a weapon learned to fight. Scientists who had studied peaceful applications of physics were gathered together to build the most destructive weapon their world had ever seen. The collective's models predicted such a transformation should take at minimum 50 standard cycles. The humans had done it in 4. Council member Threshock raised a manipulator appendage. The elderly being's scales had paled to an unhealthy gray. Perhaps this was an isolated incident, a statistical anomaly. Vexal had anticipated this response. The historian switched to the next data set. The presentation showed a disease that had spread across Earth. The humans called it a pandemic. It threatened their entire species. According to every model the collective possessed, developing a vaccine for such a pathogen should require between 10 and 15 cycles. This was the standard across all observed species. Biology moved at certain speeds. Research required certain steps. These were universal constants. The humans developed multiple vaccines in less than 1 cycle. The council chamber erupted in disbelief. Several members demanded to see the raw data. Vexal provided it. The numbers did not lie. The humans had simply refused to accept the limitations that every other species in the galaxy considered immutable. But the historian was not finished. The next segment of the presentation covered what the humans called the space race. 2 of their political factions had competed to reach their moon. At the start of this competition, neither faction had ever successfully launched an object into orbit. Their technology was primitive. Their understanding of space travel was theoretical at best. 12 cycles later, humans walked on their moon. The collective's models suggested that any species should require at minimum 200 cycles to progress from basic atmospheric flight to lunar landing. This was not opinion. This was mathematical certainty based on 9 million cycles of observation. The humans had apparently not consulted the mathematics. Vexal paused the presentation to let this information settle. The historian could see the realization spreading across the council chamber like a slow-moving wave. These beings had ruled the galaxy for millions of cycles. They had never encountered anything they could not predict. They had never found a species that defied their models. Now, they understood what they were dealing with. The historian continued. The presentation moved to smaller examples, but each one carried the same disturbing pattern. When a human city was destroyed by natural disaster, the other humans mobilized to rebuild it within months. When human children were trapped in dangerous locations, entire communities dropped everything to rescue them. When human scientists faced impossible problems, they simply worked until the impossible became possible. Council member Urisua spoke for the first time. The ancient being's voice was barely a whisper. What drives them? What makes them capable of this? Vexal had asked the same question. The historian had studied human culture, human biology, human psychology. The answer was both simple and terrifying. The humans had a concept they called unity. When threatened, they possessed the ability to set aside their differences with breathtaking speed. Conflicts that had lasted generations could be forgotten overnight. Rivalries that seemed eternal could transform into alliances. Enemies who had sworn to destroy each other could stand shoulder to shoulder against a common threat. This was not supposed to be possible. The collective had observed thousands of species facing existential threats. The pattern was always the same. Internal divisions would delay response. Political factions would argue about the proper course of action. Resources would be hoarded rather than shared. By the time unity was achieved, if it was achieved at all, the threat had usually already caused irreparable damage. The humans broke this pattern every single time. Vexal showed the council a simulation. It was based on a hypothetical scenario that the collective strategic division had developed. The scenario involved a hostile force attacking Earth. The simulation used all available data on human capabilities, human psychology, and human history. The results were deeply unsettling. According to the simulation, the humans would achieve full planetary unity within 3 to 7 standard days of the attack. Their militaries would coordinate. Their scientists would collaborate. Their industries would convert. Their populations would mobilize. What had been a divided world of competing nations would become a single unified species with one goal. The simulation predicted that within 30 standard days, humanity would have developed new weapons specifically designed to counter the threat. Within 60 days, they would have manufactured these weapons in sufficient quantities to mount a serious defense. Within 120 days, they would be ready to launch a counterattack. The council sat in horrified silence. Vexilla reminded them that the collective's fastest mobilization time against an external threat was 7,000 cycles. That response had been considered remarkably efficient. It had been studied and celebrated for millions of cycles afterward. The humans could match it in 4 months. Council member Threshock spoke again. The elder's voice had lost all pretense of calm. We must contain them before they reach space, before they realize what else is out there. Vexal had anticipated this response as well. The historian brought up the final segment of the presentation. The humans had already reached space. Their primitive vessels were already exploring their solar system. Their radio signals had been broadcasting into the cosmos for over a century. And most disturbing of all, they were already searching for signs of other intelligent life. They wanted to find the collective. The council chamber descended into chaos. Members shouted over each other. Some called for immediate action. Others argued for caution. A few suggested that the data must be flawed, that no species could truly be this dangerous. Vexal waited for silence. When it came, the historian delivered the final piece of information. The humans had a saying. Vexal had discovered it buried deep in their cultural archives. It was simple, as human wisdom often was. But it contained everything the council needed to understand about this species. The saying was this: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Vexal explained the implications. If the collective approached humanity as a threat, the humans would unite against them. Every nation, every faction, every individual human would set aside their differences. They would pour their terrifying capacity for rapid adaptation into the singular goal of defeating the collective. But if the collective approached humanity as a potential ally, something remarkable might happen. The humans might turn that same capacity outward. They might direct their impossible speed, their refusal to accept limitations, their ability to unite against common enemies toward goals that benefited everyone. The council fell silent once more. This time, the silence was thoughtful rather than fearful. Vexal concluded the presentation with a recommendation. The collective had two choices. They could try to contain humanity and face a species that had never once failed to overcome containment. Or they could extend a hand of friendship and gain an ally unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The historian reminded the council that the humans had just 1 century ago been fighting among themselves with primitive chemical explosives. Now they were reaching for the stars. In another century, at their current rate of advancement, they would be knocking on the collective's door. The question was not whether the collective would deal with humanity. The question was what kind of relationship that would be. Council member Urashua made the motion. It was seconded immediately. The vote was unanimous for the first time in 300,000 cycles. The collective would send a delegation to Earth. They would approach the humans peacefully. They would offer technology, resources, and partnership. They would do whatever was necessary to ensure that when humanity finally stepped onto the galactic stage, they stepped onto it as friends rather than enemies. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Vexal watched the council members file out of the chamber. The historian had done the job assigned. The warning had been delivered. The decision had been made. But privately, Vexal wondered if it was already too late. The humans were coming whether the collective was ready or not. They had looked up at the stars and decided to reach for them. Nothing in the entire history of the galaxy had ever stopped a species once they made that choice. And no species in the entire history of the galaxy had ever made that choice with quite the same determination as humanity. The historian turned off the presentation equipment and headed for the exit. There was more research to be done, more human history to study, more impossible achievements to catalog. Vexal suspected the work would never be finished. The humans seemed intent on adding new impossibilities to the list faster than any researcher could document them. It was, the historian reflected, both the most terrifying and the most wonderful thing about them. Far across the void, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, the humans continued their daily lives. They argued with each other over small matters. They competed for resources and recognition. They fought over borders and beliefs. To an outside observer, they might have seemed hopelessly divided. But that observer would have missed the deeper truth. A child fell into a well somewhere on the planet. Within hours, people from dozens of nations had offered help. Strangers who had never met and would never meet worked together to save a life that meant nothing to them personally. They succeeded, as humans almost always succeeded when they chose to care. A new disease emerged in a distant region. Scientists from competing nations immediately began sharing data. Laboratories that normally guarded their research jealously threw open their doors. The disease was contained before it could spread beyond its origin point. A natural disaster struck a coastal community. Ships and aircraft from around the world converged on the location. People who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods stood side by side, pulling survivors from the wreckage. The community was rebuilt larger and stronger than before. These events happened every day on Earth. The humans barely noticed them. To them, this was simply what beings did when others were in trouble. They could not imagine functioning any other way. They had no idea how unique this made them. They had no idea that observers from beyond the stars were watching with a mixture of awe and terror. They had no idea that ancient civilizations were rewriting their strategic doctrines based on human behavior. They had no idea that the most powerful beings in 3 galaxies now considered them the most dangerous species ever to evolve. They simply went about their lives, helping each other when help was needed, fighting each other when fighting seemed necessary, and reaching ever upward toward the stars that beckoned them. The universe held its breath and waited to see what they would do next. In the council chambers of the Galactic Collective, the preparation for first contact had begun. Teams were assembled. Protocols were drafted. Speeches were written and rewritten. Every possible outcome was analyzed and planned for, except one. Nobody thought to plan for the possibility that the humans might simply welcome them. Nobody considered that a species so good at fighting might be equally good at making peace. Nobody imagined that the same unity that made humans terrifying in war might make them extraordinary in friendship. That oversight would prove significant. When the collective's delegation finally arrived on Earth, they expected suspicion. They expected fear. They expected demands and threats and lengthy negotiations. They had prepared for every conceivable form of resistance. What they got was a handshake and an invitation to dinner. The humans, it turned out, had been waiting for this moment their entire existence. They had always known they were not alone. They had always hoped that someone would come. They had always believed that when that day arrived, they would face it together, and they did. The news of first contact spread across Earth in hours. People gathered in public spaces to watch the broadcasts. Strangers hugged each other in the streets. Old enemies shook hands. Divisions that had seemed permanent melted away like morning frost. The humans had found their common enemy, and it was loneliness. They united against it with the same impossible speed that had terrified the collective's researchers. Within days, Earth spoke with one voice. Within weeks, humanity had organized itself for the greatest adventure in its history. Within months, the first joint human collective missions were launching toward distant stars. Vexal watched these developments from the research station orbiting Earth's moon. The historian had requested this posting personally. After spending so long studying humans from afar, the chance to observe them up close was too valuable to pass up. What the historian saw confirmed every conclusion from the original report. The humans were exactly as remarkable as the data had suggested. They adapted to new situations with breathtaking speed. They formed bonds with the collective's delegation faster than anyone had thought possible. They asked questions that forced ancient species to reconsider assumptions millions of cycles old. They were, in short, everything the historian had feared and hoped they would be. The research continued. New data was collected. New impossibilities were documented. The list grew longer every day. And somewhere in the vastness of space, other species were beginning to take notice of the small blue world and its remarkable inhabitants. Some of those species would eventually try to threaten Earth. They would learn, as the collective had learned, that threatening humanity was the surest way to unite them. But that was a story for another time. For now, the humans and their new allies looked out at the stars together. The universe stretched before them, vast and mysterious and full of possibilities. They could hardly wait to explore it.